Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Straight Talking Leadership with me, Chris Pienkowski. My special guest today is Kyle Hogan. Let me introduce Kyle, and then we will get into talking about his leadership journey. So, Kyle refers to himself as a developer of human capital. He's a personal and professional coach. His academic background is in political science and psychology with a master's degree in strategic studies. Kyle's got certificates in Lean Six Sigma, CrossFit, and an executive coaching certificate from the ICF. Kyle's experience for 15 years has been as a personal coach in fitness and athletics, but also having over 3 decades of experience as a leader in the United States Army, leading organizations ranging from 40 people to over 4,000 people. And right now, Kyle is joining us from South Texas, where he and his family currently live. Kyle, welcome to the show.
Hey, Chris, thank you so much for having me on today, and I appreciate that. Thanks for the warm introduction. Life's pretty good in South Texas. You know, it gets warm in the summertime, but right now it's beautiful outside, and we love the spring and the fall, so it's awesome. So I appreciate you having me on.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us. I can't wait to get into this conversation. So, one of the things that I do before we start talking about leadership is I like to do a warm up that I call the Mad Minute. And really, it's just a couple questions that have absolutely nothing to do about leadership, but it's just to stimulate that gray matter between our ears. Ready for the Mad Minute?
Let's do this.
All right. So, question number 1. If your dog had pockets, what would you find in his pockets?
My socks. The dog digs into dirty clothes every night. I have an attention deficit dog. It never seems like it gets enough attention. It's a golden retriever. And the dog digs my socks out and brings them out in front of my wife and I to say, hey, look at me. So it'd be my socks.
Nice. So we've got 2 dogs. Our one dog, Penny, is a pit bull, and she's a few marbles shy of a full sack, but she has to be constantly like soothing on something. We've got a cabinet in the kitchen that creaks, and she knows that she needs to go grab a bone or something to chew on. Otherwise, she just goes batty. So she would carry some kind of soothing toy in her pocket. And my dog Rocky is a shepherd mix, but he's also a little chunky, and I guarantee he would have snacks in his pockets.
Nothing wrong with snacks in the pocket.
That's
right.
right.
Scooby snack here and there. That's awesome.
That's right. So question number 2. You have the opportunity to go back in time, any point in time, and spend 1 hour interviewing somebody. Who do you go back and have a 1 hour interview with? Conversation.
Chris, that's a tough one to get the brain matter speaking. I heard somebody, I think Joe Rogan asked this question to somebody similar, and I believe it was Kid Rock. Kid Rock said he'd go back and talk to Jesus, and that's a great one to start with. There's so many opportunities. Being a service member, maybe going back and talking to George Washington and some of the framers of our Constitution. What was going through your mind when you were looking at seceding from the British, creating our own colony, and becoming the United States of America? What was the thought process behind that? It'd probably take more than an hour, but George Washington, I'd go back and talk to our founding father.
Yeah. When I was asked that question the first time, and it's one of the reasons I have it in the rotation for my Mad Minute, my go-to was Ben Franklin. And, similar reason, I'm fascinated with the founding fathers, being born and raised in Philadelphia, that where the birthplace of our nation is in my backyard.
Mm-hmm.
But Ben Franklin has always been my favorite founding father, just because he's such an interesting character. Like, so many of his inventions are still alive and well today.
Absolutely.
So he's had such an influence on the world. I think a conversation with Ben Franklin would be pretty mind-blowing.
That's a great answer, Chris. Maybe I'll change my answer because he's also a great statesman, and his diplomacy and what he was able to do negotiating treaties and deals across the globe is impressive outside of his entrepreneurial spirit and an inventor. So that's a great one, Chris. Appreciate that.
You got it. My second son is named after him. I've been infatuated with Ben Franklin for many years. So, Kyle, thanks for playing along with the Mad Minute. I always like to just kind of break the ice and warm us up with that. Now to the meat of the conversation, which is about leadership. Share with us, what was your first experience leading people and how did that go?
When I think back across a few years within the service, when I came in the Army initially, everybody's equal and you're all trying to work your way through. And I had earned a little bit of responsibility and I was in charge of maybe one or two people. And it was in my initial break in service after 3 years, I went to college and I was in the National Guard on the side, but it was leading the men of my fraternity. I think is the first impactful leadership lesson I learned. And the lesson was when nobody's getting paid to do something, how can you influence others to accomplish that goal?
Mhm.
How do you get a bunch of rowdy men, young men, to center and focus on accomplishing, whether it was doing work at the Ronald McDonald House or for Special Olympics or just to clean up our fraternity area? How do you encompass, empower, and enable those individuals to come together? And I found myself while I was in college in various leadership positions. And maybe because I was a little bit older, I came in as a 21-year-old freshman. Of course, I'm everybody's friend at 21, but I still looked young enough that a lot of people mistook me for an 18-year-old, which was fine. But I think that 3-year break gave me enough understanding and development at the small scale that I was able to apply it in many different volunteer organizations while I was in college. So I think that's the first taste of leadership I had, was leading volunteers as a college student.
Leading volunteers is always, there's always a different dynamic with that because people volunteer for different reasons, right? I've got an affinity towards a cause. Um, it's something that I know has helped my family, whatever, but they're not being paid, right? You have to
Mhm.
tap into that intrinsic, what motivates you to volunteer for this, and then be able to influence them, persuade them. Um, yeah, leading volunteers is definitely a different animal than leading people that are being paid to do a job or are in the service and it's like, hey, that's your job description, that's your MOS, this is what you got to do, we've got a mission to complete. But yeah, volunteer leadership is different ball of wax. And
Absolutely. I'm sorry, go
I
ahead.
can relate to the being late in the game of college and being everyone's friend. I was 26 when I was a freshman. So same thing, I when I needed help with something or, everyone wanted to be my friend because I could buy those kegs and, hey, I also need a calculus tutor. Let's do a little horse trading here.
I think if you look across the landscape and those individuals who've been successful in both in and out of service and public private sectors, a lot of them have an athletic background. So if you have progressed and understand team dynamics over time, that's why I'm such a huge supporter and advocate for team athletics, because you gain and learn so many valuable tools and character development that comes from that, that's bigger than yourself. The team efforts are always bigger than the individual effort. That's how it should be. And then as you mature and you matriculate through those years and through those positions, you find yourself in, by proxy and by time, in positions of authority, if you will, the team captain or the unofficial team captain and team influencer. So I was a rower in college, and although I wasn't the team captain, I was one of the older cats, and the coach always referred to me as a team dad. So it was also some of those athletic type events that allowed that leader development to take place, and I think that's prevalent in a lot of different athletic endeavors.
You're right. When I think about people that I know who have been successful from a leadership standpoint or that are high performers within a team. They're not necessarily the designated leader, but they're often seen by their peers as that
Mhm.
kind of go-to person. I'd say that probably 90% of them had some kind of athletic background, and they've realized from a young age the importance of teamwork, and we're all we're all trying to accomplish the same. We're all trying to win the game, right? Um, if you were mentoring a young leader, would you suggest, even as an adult, that they try to find some kind of team activity, maybe even outside of their profession, to help them with their leadership skills?
Absolutely. So I'm a little biased, and we've joked about this in the past. I'm a full cult Kool-Aid drinker of the CrossFit Kool-Aid, and
Mhm.
I've actually successfully recruited individuals into different organizations by watching their performance in the gym. Did they shave reps? Did they hang out after they completed their workout to cheer on and encourage others? Did they help clean up after the workout? And I know you roll quite a bit. And you can apply this in the BJJ environment as well. While they're not actively rolling, are they encouraging others? Are they studying the movements of others to make themselves better? Are they helping and bringing water and supporting and cleanup? Are they doing a collective community endeavor, or are they just in it for themselves? So, absolutely, and you can probably apply that to a church softball team. You can apply in many different variables, even as an adult.
Yeah, that's I've never the pieces were coming together as you were saying this, but I'm thinking about the guys that I train with, and
Mhm,
there's there's a small handful of us who after class will be the ones to mop the mats. But
mhm.
now that I'm thinking about those guys who mop up the mats after class, they are also the ones that are most active. If they're taking a round off, they're looking for lower belts to coach. They're looking to help out. So, yeah, those connections didn't happen until just now. But I'm like, yeah, I can always count on like those three or four guys. If the mats aren't being mopped, they're going to step in and do it. And they're also going to be helping other folks to get better at the craft.
Now, it's not a perfect system. Every
Sure.
system's flawed, but you could probably spend a year with them, step back, and hear of a job opening or a leadership position available, and say, you know what, I know a guy or a gal, and that individual meets some screening criteria right off the bat.
You're right. Um, so along your leadership journey, from a young man until where you are now, who has inspired you the most?
You know, as I think about that question, Chris, I think it comes back to my grandfather. He was very impactful. So growing up, my father was not actively in my life. He would come in and go out, uh, but not as active as my pops. That's why I call him Pop.
Mhm.
Pop was always there. Pop was a Air Force veteran. He was an enlisted service member, electronics technician, and went through officer training school. Became a rated navigator, and then became a pilot. So he had bootstrapped himself up and grew up in the Northeast. So he's always been that individual I looked up to. Very entrepreneurial. He got out of the service, started a real estate business, then ran a newspaper home sales business, and then got into the computer programming side of things in the late 70s and progressed that and was a programmer all the way through the 80s. And I remember the whole Y2K bug, and any young people listening to that don't understand Y2K, but he was rewriting code for banks because their code wasn't, they thought it was not going to be effective as the clocks rolled over and he only had two digits instead of four. So throughout his entire lifetime, we threw baseball in the backyard until he was well into his 60s.
Okay.
So his activity level, his jovial nature. Uh, if you've ever seen Grumpy Old Men, Walter Matthau,
Mhm.
he's
Yep.
very much that character in Grumpy Old Men as Walter Matthau. So he's been somebody that I've looked up to as a leader for the entirety of my life. He was always, when we'd go to someplace in a social environment, people would see him. Hey, Roger, great to see you. Thanks for all you've done. People would seek him out. So when you're a person of character, and you've demonstrated that level of leadership, it becomes apparent and people flock to you. So that's really, I think, what was driving my thoughts as a leader growing up.
Did he inspire you to join the military? Was that
Absolutely. Some of my youngest memories are in the back of a Cessna. They used to have flying clubs in the Army. Although he was in the Air Force, he flew for the CAP and for some of those flying clubs for a long time as an instructor. And I remember being a bag of that airplane. I've always wanted to be involved in aviation. And when I was at the age to make that transition into the service, the Air Force didn't want to talk to me, and the Army did. So I found myself in the Army working in the aviation business, and that's where I've been for about 35 years.
all right? Um, I want to backtrack to something that you said just a minute ago about character. Where do you see the importance of character as it relates to leadership and leadership effectiveness?
Do you demonstrate the behaviors you're asking of your employees? Do you look to enable success in others the same way you want them to believe and enable success in you? Those characteristics of integrity, humility, to me are paramount as some of the behaviors you would want somebody to demonstrate to be willing to follow. If I wouldn't follow you into 7-Eleven, I'm not going to follow you as a subordinate.
Right.
So, and that's, there's a lot of stuff when you look at it on LinkedIn and on social media. The common phrase is people don't leave jobs, they leave leaders, they leave managers, they leave folks that are above them who don't demonstrate the characteristics or the behaviors that they want to emulate. You're always going to have opportunities, little lessons, what not to do. And I've had tremendous leaders across my career from my very first to my current boss that they're all superstars. But every once in a while you work for somebody you just may not align with. And it doesn't mean that they're bad. It just means some of the behaviors, actions, and characteristics they display that you don't want to display those things. So sometimes it's a lesson on what not to do.
I think a lot of times, if you're paying attention in your leadership journey, it's extracting those things of what not to do that I think land a lot harder than the things to do. At least that's been my experience. Like
Sure.
whether it's been me making the mistake or watching someone else make a mistake and saying, man, I need to learn from that, not do that again. I just think we learn from our failures and close failures of others that have the greatest impact on, what to do versus what not to do.
That's a great point, Chris. I love the way you nested in the learning from failure aspect. And I'm by far nobody's perfect. I have my share of failures. And what I share with others is please learn from my mistakes so you don't repeat them. And the humility aspect that I'm willing to say, hey, yeah, I jacked that up. Don't do that. That was dumb. And I often joke that I would fire myself, going back 10, 20, 32 years, who knows? There have been times where I didn't perform at the level that I wanted. I didn't meet my own expectations. So if I didn't meet somebody else's expectations, that's good. It's not good, but it's good to learn from that failure, if you will.
Yeah. One of the things that I talk about often is these 5 principles of high impact leadership. The fourth principle is conviction and caring. And I see those two things going hand in hand, where the conviction side is, hey, I know what my values are. I know what the values of the organization are. I know what the standards are that I have for myself and the standards that I expect of everyone else. And leaders have to not only demonstrate those standards, but help people and hold them accountable to reaching those standards. But then on the caring side, it's the having a genuine, want for your people to be the best they can be. It's saying, hey, you're having a bad day. I recognize you're having a bad day. Let's have a conversation about it. May not be work related at all, but it's as a leader, you need to, when your people know that you have their back beyond just the surface level, they're going to go that much higher above and beyond for you when push comes to shove.
100%, Chris. You're spot on. And I love the way you talked into the aspect that when people show up, and they're normally very good, and you have this drop in performance or drop in behavior, and they're not doing something accurate. There's always something else behind the scenes because nobody wants to show up and suck.
Right.
Everybody wants to show up a winner. So being a leader with the character to dig in and go, hey, what's going on, man? Are you good? And oh, I'm fine. No, you're not.
Right.
Let's be honest.
Yeah.
Let's have real talk here, as the kids say. Real talk. So I love the way you brought that up, Chris.
Have you experienced in your career, you kind of just alluded to it, the answer a lot of times is I'm fine, right? And then we have to peel that onion and just keep peeling. Some people will be totally resistant. In my experience, 80% of the time you can get to the right layer where they're willing to have that conversation. But then there are others that are just like, look, I said I'm fine, drop it. Um, how far do you go before you say, okay, I'm going to drop it. I'm going to respect your boundaries here?
It's a great question. I think a lot of times it's going to depend on the relationship I have with that individual. If we're close, I'm not dropping it. I'm
Mhm.
digging. I'm like a knife. I'm digging in. But I'm also, when I consciously say this is what I'm going to do, I realize I might be on board for a little while. This may go a little longer than I have time for. So, do I really have a conversation or an appointment in 15 minutes, or can I just let that go? So, being honest with yourself, if you want to get an answer, sometimes the answer is going to be heavy. So, are you ready to carry that burden? So that's one aspect, and then also you just set a spot on everybody that I'm fine, I'm good. Those 2 4-letter words are. I threw a little snippet out a little while ago, a little video on LinkedIn about that because we hide behind I'm fine, I'm good,
Mhm.
knowing that we're tore up about something, and maybe you're a Phillies fan, I'm a Cowboys fan, so at the end of the day, I had a rough, we had a
Right.
rough spot in the playoffs. So no, I'm not fine, but just using that as an example, understanding the depth of the individual. Hey, if it's somebody I don't have a deep relationship with, I may let them pass and let it play out a little bit longer and then follow back up. Now Tuesday, you're having a rough day. You all right now, man? What's going on? And that follow up sometimes will open the door for somebody to be a little bit more open to deepening that conversation.
The relationships are so important for people to be able to open up, right? It's relationships and it's trust. Uh, I'm going to stick on this topic for just a second. One of the things that I think is important for leaders is to be vulnerable, right? And to be
Mhm.
transparent. There have been times that I've gotten that resistance from somebody and I'll share with them something that I've been struggling with. And it may have absolutely nothing to do with what they might be going through, but I have found that just by opening up the curtain a little bit and showing myself as a human, that has also helped people to open up and like, oh, okay, maybe this guy can relate to me. You know,
Absolutely. So we talk about knowing your why and understanding, as you're trying to motivate an organization or enable an organization to get to an objective, a KPI, trying to accomplish this task, the vulnerability of saying, I'm struggling too, also applies. That's where that trust is built, not only in the personal or the professional side, but also on the personal side. Hey, I don't have this all figured out because it's often that we look at leaders as these folks that are on a statue, on a pedestal, that they've got everything figured out. And I learned a few years ago, it was sort of an epiphany for me as a mid-grade leader within the army. And I thought I'd peel the curtain back, and there's a bunch of folks in there who had all the answers, or the big book was open, and it was like, oh,
right.
it ain't like that. It's just a bunch of cats that are grinding, and they're trying to do the best that they can. So when you demonstrate that vulnerability to your subordinate, sometimes, hey, we're all headed down this road together. I've been around a little bit. I've had some more sets and reps, so I've got a little bit more experience. But I trust the team that we're on and everything that the collective brings to the table. So I believe we're going to be successful. But I'm not I'm not 100% on anything except death
Yeah,
and taxes.
that's right. Two things for sure. Um, That's something that I find a lot in kind of the new and emerging leaders. They have this thought in their head that I I can't show vulnerability. I need to come across as the person with all the answers, and it's the kind of fake it till you make it kind of
Hmm.
mindset. And a lot of times I wonder what they're who they're modeling that leadership after, because I've always been a proponent, and you know what? I'll take that back. When I was young, I felt the same way. And it wasn't until, I probably got into my 40s that I realized it was okay for me to say, I don't know, but I'll find out. But I often wonder who's modeling this behavior for these younger people that make them want to be this like wall of stone and not be willing to, say, hey, I need help with this. I mean, that's how you empower people. When you're leading others and you tell them, I don't have the answer, but I know that you do, or you're better at this than I do. So therefore, I'm going to lean on you. I mean, what a better way to engage the folks that are working for you than to pull their expertise out.
Because I think it's a mixture of two things: ego and wisdom.
Hmm.
So as you start out younger, your ego's way up here and your wisdom's down here because you just don't have the sets and reps. And as those paths converge and you become a little bit more humble, you're working through some failures, you figure some things out, and those have gained greater wisdom at that tipping point. I think that's where that aha moment takes place. And it's going to be different for everybody. That obviously you've been around long enough to see that some egos or some leaders never that ego never drops,
Yeah.
but they probably don't have a requisite increase in wisdom, so it's to their downfall. But for those who have accelerated and become very successful, I think they've had that tipping point where the wisdom is greater than the ego, and the humility has allowed them to be successful, vulnerable, and build trust. And that success has beget additional success.
Do you think that it's the way that they handle failures or setbacks that it chips away at the ego? It requires a little emotional intelligence, but that's what helps to chip away at the ego and add some weight to the scales, right? To even out
Mhm.
the wisdom and knowledge, um, versus hard-headed people who don't take accountability. They want to throw
Mhm.
everyone else under the bus. Those folks, I believe, get limited. The ego continues to stay up here in the wisdom because they're not letting it happen.
I think I had a discussion recently about a month ago, and I remember even now, this is again, it was a month ago. I had a failure versus I am a failure. So making that separation, because depending on the level of magnitude of what took place, the emotional connection of that could have been very significant. So it's hard to make that separation to go, I had a failure. I learned from that versus, man, I feel like a failure because I let my family down or friends down. I was unable to meet this obligation. It was financially uh, ruinous, or there are other variables that take place. So I think that's a piece of it as well. When can you make that mental separation because what you are versus what happened? I think that plays into that as well.
What advice would you give that, that other leader, whether they're kind of fresh in a leadership role or the mid-career, but they're struggling with that I am a failure versus I had a failure? Because if you believe that you are a failure, it's really hard to move forward. And when you can recognize I had a failure, I can address it and learn and move forward. But how do you have that conversation with someone and help that breakthrough happen?
I think that's where coaching comes in, and it's such a powerful tool. And as it expands, even within the service, the Army's trying to increase 100-fold, going from 200 to 2,000 executive coaches within the ranks to help that first line leadership, that junior leader. As we used to talk about, when you become an NCO, a non commissioned officer, now you're in charge of soldiers. your default leadership setting is a-hole. It's just by default.
Mm-hmm.
Because oftentimes that's all you know. Just, okay, we're going to yell at folks. And that's just how you get somebody's attention. Positional authority is what you have.
Yep.
So taking that coaching expertise and pouring it into the most first line level supervisors. And we're doing this in an environment that's not a traditional, I'm in a manufacturing environment. So we produce things. So it's very different from the traditional army. And I'm working for a lot of civilians. And talking to those civilians, what have you done in your life that you felt good about? How do you expand on? How do you peel that onion back to go, okay, what's something that here in South Texas on the coast, there's a lot of fishing going on. What's the biggest fish you ever caught? What were the conditions that allow you to catch that fish? How often were you able to do that? Now, back that up. How often did you not catch something? What was different? So how to learn from the environment, how to learn from those small failures to build patience and understanding and some empathy when you see other people, and going back to the fine and good conversation, how do you tie all of that back into a junior leader and help develop their emotional intelligence to be successful? And a lot of that's all intertwined, Chris.
It is. Um, a lot of times I will also look for like real life examples of people that have made it that you're looking up to. And I've used this several times when people have said to me, "Oh, I feel like a failure." I'll say, "Do you know who Michael Jordan is?" Well, yeah, of course I know who Michael Jordan is. Would you argue that he's one of the greatest basketball players of all time? Yeah, in my mind, he's the GOAT. Some people, he's top 3, right? But then I'll ask them, do you know what his shot percentage was? Well, no, it's got to be astronomical. Michael Jordan's career shot percentage was 53%. So for every shot that he took, 1 out of 2 were actually making it into the bucket. So if you're going to say Michael Jordan is one of the best of all times, he failed half the times that he took a shot. So let's put it in perspective here. Are you failing all the time? Are you failing half the time? Less than half the time? How do we make you the GOAT of what you're doing, realizing that nobody is perfect? Like I always like to use some kind of analogy. I think that gets the point across to people, and they relate to it. They're like, oh, that never looked at it that way. That makes a whole lot of sense.
Absolutely. So just tweak that slightly. If it's a baseball metaphor and you're batting 500, you're in the Hall of Fame.
That's
You
right.
know, you'd break it to, hey, if you're hitting above 300, so you're only successfully making contact with the ball and getting on base, 30% of the time, and
Yeah.
that makes you a major leaguer. So using those sports analogies sometimes and those other aspects, uh, ball up a bunch of paper and start throwing it in a trash can. How many times do you miss? Why do you miss? Analyzing that. So learning from something simple as that. How do you learn from that failure? Or I'm a big fan of the Dude Perfect guys, and I don't know if you're familiar with them.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the behind the scenes stuff. They ain't making no shots on the first one. There's a lot of B-roll of them practicing, but it looks amazing when they chuck that thing off the top of a building and it goes in. Occasionally it's a ringer, but it's probably about 10% of the time. But it's the diligence, the effort, the personal responsibility to come back and go to the free throw line and continue to shoot free throws until you cross that 80% threshold on a free throw. The diligence and the work ethic to be better.
I think that it's that constant pursuit of just being 1% better every day, right? Progress
Mhm.
over perfection. Um, we were just talking right before I hit record. I just got back from Dallas and I was down there speaking to a group of CEOs about leadership. One of the other speakers was a former athlete turned D1 coach, and she was talking about the importance of practice and like, hey, we practice ugly, right? You show up for practice and your hair's a mess. Your whole focus is to get better so that come game time, the Dude Perfect videos is what's showing up. But all the B-roll is what happens when you're practicing. so that when it comes time to deliver, you're ready to rock and roll.
I think if you take that sort of story back to the young leader, and we talked about ego, it's sometimes it's an education piece. There's an expectation or assumption that this stuff just comes naturally. And there are naturally gifted leaders who are extremely charismatic and thoughtful and are just good. And I've been around them, and I'm just at awe of them, and I appreciate them. And there are some leaders who just grind. They just show up and they do the work and they learn and they grow and they listen and they pull great teams together to be collectively successful. So it's a mix of both of those. But for the young leader, if you're not naturally talented or gifted, understanding it's going to take work. It's not going to come overnight. And then in our society, we'll get on this tangent, whether it's drive-through restaurant, a drive-through cleaner, or a drive-through teller at a bank, and heck, you don't even use banks anymore. It's all Venmo and Cash App. That instant gratification,
Mm-hmm.
DoorDash, uh, Grubhub, all of those things that I'll just order it on my phone. There's no work.
Right.
And I think that's going to be the transition point when people realize that although you can learn a bunch from your phone, you're going to have some experiential learning by going through those processes to validate what you think you know.
You're absolutely true. Right. I mean, I just had a conversation with someone about work ethic, and we both came to the conclusion that the participation trophies have really contributed to this lack of effort that people put in. And no, I should be, by the time I'm 30, I should be at this point in my career. By the time I'm 40, well, that's not how the real world works. Just showing up isn't going to help you to climb that ladder. You need to put in the effort. You need to put in the reps. There are no participation trophies once you're out in the real world, but people,
Absolutely.
it's reinforced through these phone apps and stuff like that.
Whether
But
it's
I didn't
being a
mean to cut you
farmer.
off.
No, that's fine. You're spot on. You got to put the work in. If you want to be, I mentioned fishing or athletics. There's nothing. We can go to the Malcolm Gladwell and they debate the 10,000 hour rule. You got to put it into sets and reps. There ain't a whole lot of folks getting into Juilliard who aren't good and don't have those hours below them. There's not the 0.1% athletes who go to the professional level who haven't put in the work.
Mhm.
And at that point, it's filtered out. If you're not willing to grind and give that effort, then you're not going to excel at the next level. And it's okay to have a season of comfortability. So maybe you're in a job environment and you have a new addition to the family, whether that's a furry baby or a regular baby or whatever you're doing, that you're going to take a pause, and that's okay. But realize, don't let comfort turn into complacency, where now you have an expectation of continued progression. But if you're not putting in the work, there's no additional progression. You reap what you sow. If you're not sowing those seeds, you're not going to reap the benefits of those.
That's right. I had this conversation with my boys all the time. I've got 3 teenage boys, and hey, if you want to achieve these goals, you need to put in the work. No one's handing it to you, and I try to demonstrate that as much as I can too. Like my office is in my house, so my boys see how often I'm working. They see that I'm going to the gym late at night or jujitsu or whatever it is. So I'm trying to model that behavior.
Mhm.
Not everyone has that opportunity to have someone modeling that behavior for them. But the people that do get it. And sometimes the people that don't, for me, like I learned that on my own. Um, I grew up in what they'd call a working poor household by
Mhm.
today's standards. And it was always told to me like, this is your budget for sneakers. If you want those expensive sneakers, you got to figure out a way. All right, I'm going to go mow lawns. I'm going to go do whatever because I want that. The answer was never given to me. It was always, you need to figure it out. And you know what? At this stage in my life, I'm damn happy that's the direction I was pointed in to figure it out because it has helped me out tremendously.
Absolutely. My wife hates when I say this, but in the conversations with my kids, don't be the king of the knuckleheads. If you're the smartest person in your group, find another group. And that's pretty common. You'll hear people talk about that. But I think that goes to your point. If you don't have an example in the home that you grew up in, which again, my grandfather was around, but he wasn't in my home. So it was seeking out those other individuals who forced me to be better. I've never been the fastest, the strongest, the smartest, but I daggum well will learn from those around me who are. And I will
Mhm.
take that. And plagiarism is the greatest form of flattery outside of academia. Oh, he said that? Let me write that down because that sounds like it's good. Let me research that. How can I be better? What did they do? What is the group that you're surrounded by? Do they make you better or do they make you bitter? What are they doing to help enable your success? And what are you contributing back to the group as well? So finding those groups are paramount to success in a leader perspective.
Yeah, I love what you just said there. We don't have to have every original thought. There I don't even know how many original thoughts there still are, right? We're like regurgitating what's been said before and just kind of repackaging it in our own way. Um, but don't dismiss the accomplishments and the things that other people have done. You just figure out how to apply them to you, right? You don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. The wheel's been
Hmm.
invented. You just figure out how to roll it faster, how to make it better, whatever. But I think a lot of people get hung up on that too, is wanting to be original. But original can come in so many different ways. You don't have to invent everything.
Absolutely, you gave a great perspective on the wheel, and I use this little metaphor pretty regularly when I'm talking to folks. And because you'll ask the question in a group, and you'll hear people say, "If it's not broke, don't fix it." And I love when people say that because my answer to them is, "Look out the window and show me one set of wooden wheels in a parking lot."
Right.
So wood wheels are very effective, but how do we evolve? How do we grow? How do we continue to improve? Always improve your surroundings. So that's spot on to what you were talking to, Chris. Being able to take what you have, you don't necessarily have to be original, but what can you do to make it better?
That's right. Uh, Kyle, over the past 10 years, what would you say has changed most in the way that you lead people?
Chris, I think over the last decade, a lot of it's been driven by self reflection. Got a lot out of the multipliers book. I don't know if you're familiar with that one, multipliers and diminishers. And there's a chapter, and I think it's chapter 17, talked about accidental diminisher. So as much as I thought I was doing the right thing, pretty much an extrovert. I talk to think, so I'm speaking out loud, and sometimes it gets me in trouble. But I love conversations, and I love the rah rah stuff, and I get people excited, and I'm passionate. But that's me, and what I learned through the process that sometimes that becomes an accidental diminisher on somebody who's maybe an introvert or they're not as socially active as I am, and I'm wearing them out. So trying to read the room better. So when I'm talking to somebody that I don't want to be a drain to them, I want to fill their bucket, not empty it. So that's the big change over the last decade on trying to be more aware. Am I wearing this person out or am I building them up? When we have a conversation, how is the exchange taking place? So trying to be more aware of my surroundings, the emotional intelligence piece is really where I've tried to shape and evolve in the last decade.
It's funny you say that because one thing, and it's probably been over the past decade for me as well, is I try I try to be very purposeful of when I speak versus when I let other people speak. And I may know that answer, but uh, A, I don't want to come across as a know-it-all, but B, I want to see other people's wheels turn because maybe their answer is better than mine. But that's the emotional intelligence piece probably over the past 10 years for me has been the greatest change where I take the approach of like big ears, small mouth, right? We were given two and one for a reason.
Mhm.
And as a leader, you don't need to have all the answers. Back to what we said earlier, but putting that into practice, hey, let this conversation breathe a little bit. Let other people have the limelight. And if they come up with an answer that's better than yours, you better freaking celebrate them and let them know.
That's a great perspective, Chris. I agree with you 100%. I think for me, it was probably a year ago, I had a bit of an epiphany. Sometimes I get too excited, too passionate, and I find myself interrupting people in a conversation. And a colleague had asked that question. They threw it out there on LinkedIn, and I really reflected on that. And I can't speak for everybody. I'll speak for myself. I felt a lot of times that behavior was driven by something we talked about earlier in the conversation about the whole imposter syndrome and the ego piece. For me, it's a validation piece. What I have found is I'm trying to inject in a conversation because I want people to say, Kyle, you're good enough too. You're good enough to be in this group to have that conversation.
Mhm.
We allow you here because we appreciate what you provide. And it took a long time to, again, up within the last 12 to 24 months for me to really validate myself to understand, oh, that's why I was doing what I was doing, the interrupting piece or jumping in or the one-upsmanship. I caught a fish, it was this big. I'm like, I caught a fish too, and it was this big. And
Yes.
you're trying to be a part of the conversation, not dominate it, but in your own mind, you're looking for that external validation. So that's the other aspect that goes right to what you're talking to about being able to step back a little bit and let the conversation mature.
And so now you kind of sit back like Mr. Miyagi and you just watch it unfold.
That's the goal. I still
Right.
ain't there. I just came from a meeting and I was like, "Oh, you tell them," and I'm like, "Oh, all right, let me. Oh, okay, let's back up." And as a leader, that's where I find myself. I have no problem executing, and I joke with some of our directors here that I need more Tiggers and less Eeyores because Eeyores walking around, oh poo,
Mhm.
I don't know. Yeah, nobody will ever accuse me of being an Eeyore.
Right.
I am Tigger. I am sprung load to execute. So I've got to pay that back just a little bit. Okay, let's see what's going on.
Yep. What what is your favorite part about leading other people?
Seeing others succeed. It is tremendously impactful when I get a text message or an email or a phone call or a FaceTime or a LinkedIn post when others succeed. Even if I have such a small part of that or no part, I love seeing others succeed. And I'll go back to the coaching in the CrossFit space. I had a 63-year-old fella watching him succeed to push up upside down in a handstand against the wall. He had not been upside down in 50 years, but the tremendous amount of self-worth and accomplishment he got for something as simple as being upside down.
Mhm.
It wasn't very long. He didn't do a push-up. He literally just went up against the wall and came down. And for him, that was a huge win. Or seeing somebody do a box jump. They start literally on a 1-inch plate and get up to a 16-inch box. So whatever they get to, whatever that end state is for them for that day, to see that light in their eyes that they succeeded. Or when somebody in the business world comes back and says, "Hey, we just got this deal closed. We got this bonus," or whatever they were seeing joy in the success of others has been the greatest aspect of what I consider success in leadership.
I love it. At the end of the day, that's one of my favorite things too, is like the reason that I love being in a leadership position, helping other people in a leadership position is ultimately to see others grow. I get so much joy from that. And a lot of times I have to remind myself that I love when I get those check-in texts or whatever, like, hey man, I just crushed this. Um, that other people like that too. And I'm one of these guys who I'm resistant to ask for help. I don't like share those victories. But then I will share it with certain people, and it's like, man, I'm so happy that you shared that. So I see kind of a dichotomy in me that it's like I love to do it, but I know that other people love it too, and I should do it more. I should share those things more with people that are helping me along the way, because it's not validating. That's not the right word, but it feels good to see people do well and succeed. So
Absolutely, Chris. So there's probably been many mentors and folks who've enabled your success across your leadership journey, and even at the periphery. So there's nothing wrong with you reaching out and, hey, man, Bob, I appreciate what you did. Cindy, I appreciate how you enabled me, or thanks for putting me in contact. The gratitude aspect, and I think we're so difficult when somebody thanks you for something, and you immediately dismiss it.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, I appreciate. Ah, it's nothing. Being able to accept the gratitude, that's a hard thing for some folks. They're like, yeah, downplay it. No, sometimes you just got to take it. I have this conversation with people in my really close circle pretty regular. Just accept it.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. I default to that. Like, it was my pleasure. No sweat. But to the person that I just helped, it was significant. And we need to be able to process that in our heads, right?
Mhm.
Back to the emotional intelligence, and not just fluff it off. Like, yeah, man, like, to me, it was no big deal. Well, to you, it was a big deal. So therefore, when you thank me, I should respond accordingly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Kyle, I know we're getting close to on time. One thing that I would love to hear from you, and I think that other people would love to hear too, um, what is your leadership philosophy?
So there's a story behind everything. So this one, so I was in grad school, 2000 October of 2020, right during COVID. We're in class, and we actually were an in-person class in our card cohort, and we were studying all the dead generals and dead presidents, and talking about leadership. And I was spouting off, and I thought I was crushing. And my history professor said, "Hey, Kyle, what's your leadership philosophy?" We talked about Collins and Washington and Lincoln and Eisenhower. What's your philosophy? And it really poked me in the eye. I was like, whoa, what do you mean mine? I'm giving you all the answers to the test. And he's like, no. So after some reflection, and so I came up with three things: vision, trust, and resiliency. So the vision, it allows you to see the future. It Where are you? You see where you are, you see the goal, and then you see the path to get there. That's the vision piece. The trust piece, trust is a currency of the professional leader. It's understanding you have to trust yourself, and getting past the imposter syndrome to understand that I am good enough. You have to trust your teammates that are around you. And then whatever process you have in place to achieve success, you have to trust the process and work through that. And then the resiliency piece, it carries you when you're broken. Resiliency is what allows us to be successful when we go through those failure moments. And the reality is, you're going to fail. We spoke to that earlier in our conversation. People around you, they're going to fail you. They're human. And then at the end of the day, even with all that failure, people need you. Your family needs you. Your peers need you. Your subordinates need you. The leaders that are around you, your peers need you. So you're needed. And that's that resiliency piece. So combining that vision, that trust, and that resiliency, that's sort of how I define my leadership philosophy.
I love it. And those three things, you think about like a Venn diagram, right? I can picture it in my mind, those three circles, right? Vision, trust, and resiliency. If you're even missing one, your effectiveness as a leader is diminished probably by a third or more.
Mhm.
So those three play so well together. Because yeah, we're all going to have hard times, and you need that mental toughness to just keep on going and move forward. Trust is the foundation of all relationships. It's the foundation of teams. If there's no trust within a team, good luck having a hard conversation to try to achieve an outcome when a challenge comes up. And without a vision of knowing where you want to go and being able to communicate that to your team of these are our goals, this is what we're trying to do, then it's like herding cats, right? So I love those three pieces: vision, trust, and resiliency. They all work so well hand in hand together and foundational. Those are awesome principles.
I appreciate it. I like to share that. I've had an opportunity to go back. I went through a process-based leadership course taught a few years ago, and I've gone back subsequent cohorts and been able to speak to that. And that's something I always talk about when we talk about leadership and process development. Having what is your leadership philosophy? And if they don't have one, I encourage them to create one and find something, read about some things, and figure out how do you think this fits in to nest within your character and your personality.
I love it. Kyle, before we wrap up, any closing thoughts? Anything that you think the viewers, listeners, leaders need to know before we wrap it up for today?
You're good enough. You have what it takes. And if you don't think you are, ask those around you, and they'll enable your success. And again, if you're the king of the knuckleheads, find another kingdom.
Do not be the king of the knuckleheads. That, I think, is a great place for us to wrap it up. Kyle Hogan, I really appreciate you joining us, sharing your leadership story, sharing some nuggets of information. Anyone who's watching, anyone who's listening on an audio platform, if you've gotten some nuggets out of this, you've gotten something out of the show, please like it, please share it, subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any other content. And until the next time, thanks for joining us, and lead on.